Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining. We're just gonna wait another minute as people are joining into the event.
La commenter si tu veux.
All right, I think that we'll go ahead and get started now. Welcome everybody to today's roundtable event, Adapting to Climate Change in the Mountains, What Solutions Work. My name is Alex Mackey, and I'm a project manager at Zoe Environment Network and a member of the Adaptation at Altitude program. And I have the pleasure of moderating today's event. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. We do have interpretation offered into French, and you can access this by clicking on the globe below on the right-hand side and changing the language between French and English. We'll also have the opportunity to exchange some ideas and be really interactive in today's roundtable. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat or raise your hand during the discussion portion. It would also be great if everyone could rename themselves with your name, country, and your parliament, or the name of your organization, just so we know where everybody is joining us from. So we'll just have a moment to walk through the agenda on the next slide, please. So during today's event, we're going to get to hear from a short introduction about the topic at hand, climate change adaptation in mountains. And then we're going to get to hear from two parliamentarians, Ms. Jacqueline Amongan from Uganda and Ms. Marie-Noëlle Battistel from France, who are going to share some good practice examples of different parliamentary actions that can be taken to ensure mountains are included in the national efforts to address climate change. We'll also welcome Mr. Ignacio Yaque from Chile, who will provide us with a civil society perspective. Following this, we'll move into the more interactive part, the roundtable discussion portion, where we're going to hear from you and take into account any other good practice examples from your countries, but also some of the challenges and what some of those barriers are too. So keep this in mind while we hear from our first speakers so we can get some ideas. So first of all, I'm going to set the scene a bit and share with you a little bit more. So first of all, why are we here? Mountains are an incredibly important ecosystem. They cover 25% of Earth's land surface and are present in nearly 100 or more than 100 countries, rather, but many others depend on them. This map on screen that you can see is actually the different electoral districts in mountain areas. So again, they're highly relevant for parliamentarians as well. Next slide, please. Second of all, mountains are extremely important, especially for achieving sustainable development in the SDGs. They're home to 1.2 billion people, and oftentimes these are some of the poorest and most vulnerable communities in the world. This is due to rugged conditions, a lack of infrastructure, or poor connectivity to economic opportunities. They're also very important for a variety of reasons that you can see here on this infographic, but one that I really want to highlight is that mountains also provide fresh water for more than half of the world's population. They are a key source of water, both for consumption, for providing 68% of irrigated agriculture, and also for renewable energy, such as hydropower. Finally, mountains are also highly important both for our economies, but also for the cultural heritage and the spiritual importance that they have and play in many countries around the world. Next slide, please. Mountains are very key for different issues related that are highly relevant to members of parliament. We know about food security. Many people living in the mountains, about 350 million, are facing food insecurity and rely on agriculture for their livelihoods. Water management, as I've mentioned, is also a key area. Gender and inclusion. Many of the communities living in mountain areas sometimes have difficulty to have their voices heard and raise their issues also in different groups. For biodiversity conservation, mountains are biodiversity hotspots and key ecosystems. And of course, migration and displacement, as mountain people who are living in mountains often do have to consider migrating into cities or different areas as they face different challenges. And of course, why we're here today is that when it comes to climate change, mountains are very important when it comes to adaptation. So when we think of climate change adaptation, oftentimes we think of small island developing states or sea level rise as a main issue, and mountains don't really come to mind as a main topic. But actually, a lot of the climate change impacts actually happen faster at higher elevations. So we see things like much faster temperature warming, which can lead to melting glaciers. This can also interact with changing precipitation patterns, either more or less rain, and then more frequent and intense natural hazards like landslides, avalanches, earthquakes, floods, even droughts. So we see a lot of these hazards that take place in mountain areas, but then also connect down to lower downstream areas as well. So cities or villages or communities that are downstream from the mountains are also impacted by these impacts. This can also happen in different countries, as a lot of mountains do cross borders as well. This is why the Adaptation at Altitude program is working to enhance resilience and adaptive capacity in mountain areas. And part of how we're doing this is by sharing knowledge and solutions like we're doing today to make sure that the adaptation challenges that are occurring in mountains are being addressed. With that, I'd like to pass over to Ms. Carly Johnson just to share one of the new climate resources as well from the IPU.
Thank you so much, Alex. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to colleagues who are joining us from different parts of the globe. My name is Carly Johnson, as Alex said, and I'm supporting the IPU's work on climate change. Thank you so much for joining this event. The IPU is really pleased to be co-organizing this important discussion on climate change in mountain areas with the Adaptation at Altitude program. I would like to take this opportunity for just a minute to bring to your attention some new resources at the IPU that are particularly relevant for parliamentarians, especially those working to advance sustainable development and climate action in their respective countries. So the IPU has just released a toolkit for parliamentarians on SDG-informed legislative scrutiny. This resource is designed to support parliaments in translating the SDGs into national legislation, holding governments accountable for their implementation and aligning budgets with national sustainable development plans. And it's been designed specifically for parliamentarians, and it's in very clear, accessible, and concrete language. It provides a resource with practical guidance that has many examples of the illustrative nature of connecting SDGs with other SDGs, sort of demonstrating that interconnectedness, as well as two in-depth case studies, one on gender and one on climate scrutiny. The case study on climate scrutiny is, of course, very relevant for today's discussion. It provides clear step-by-step guidance on how parliamentarians can scrutinize climate legislation to ensure that it is effective and connected to broader SDG targets, as well as the Paris Agreement, which is, of course, essential. The IPU has also recently launched two other climate publications. One is on 10 actions for stronger national climate commitments, and one is on parliamentary oversight of national climate commitments. These publications are really designed to help parliaments take a leading role in implementing their country's national climate plans. They are all freely available on the IPU website, and you will find the relevant links in the chat. We encourage you to access these resources and use them in your efforts to advance parliamentary action on climate change in your respective countries. Thank you so much. I look forward to today's discussion. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Carly. So this was just a quick presentation to give you some background information on the topic. If you'd like to learn more, we're going to share some further resources, as you can see here. We'll share the links later on in the webinar, just so you can have a look at them. So now we'd like to switch over a bit and take the opportunity to hear from some parliamentarians. So I'd like to first introduce Ms. Jacqueline Amongan, who is a member of parliament from Uganda, to share some of her experiences. So I would like to welcome her to turn her camera on and join us on the floor to share some of her experiences and inputs. Ms. Jacqueline. Let's see, are you able to hear us? There we go.
Okay, are you able to hear me?
Yes, very well, thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, and thank you so much, moderator, for this opportunity. You have already introduced me. I'm called Jacqueline Amongin, Member of Parliament of Uganda, and also representing Uganda in the East African Legislative Parliament. But at the same time, I'm the Secretary General of the African Network of Parliamentarians on Climate Change. Basically, I think this is topic on climate change and the linkage to mountainous communities is very critical, because normally when we are talking about climate change, we look at climate change in generality. But I think that communities that are communities are within the mountainous areas. For example, in Uganda, we have two huge mountains that are known globally. That is the Mountain Elgon in the eastern part of the country, and Mountain Rwenzori. A lot of tourists come to Uganda to do the mountain climbing. If you've ever heard about the Mountain Rwenzori, these communities that are based in these mountains face huge challenges, especially due to the changes in the climate. For example, of recent, Mountain Elgon in Mbale, first people were faced with extreme weather events like landslides and then floods and droughts, which led to the reallocation of people actually from those areas, because this came incidentally and anticipated. And even those who remained directly or indirectly affected. But of course, this also impacts on their livelihoods and access to water due to the melting glaciers and altered rainfall patterns, especially in Mountain Elgon and Mountain Rwenzori. So you already see that climate change is very visible in these areas compared to other areas. So this necessitates adaptation strategies, because in the situations where we have floods, where we have droughts, where we have landslides, a lot of lives are lost, but there is also a lot of adaptation measures that are needed, including changing farming practices and improved water management to mitigate the impacts of climate change. So what would be the impacts on climate change impacts on Ugandan mountain communities? I already highlighted that there is already a lot in terms of glacier melting, e.g., for example, in Mount Rwenzori, causing changes in water flow and impacting water availability for communities at the downstream. So you already see that these communities that stay at the mountainous communities are too vulnerable to climate change. And then I have already talked about the landslides and floods, and then the shifting in agricultural season, hence affecting the crop yield. So even accessibility and the crop yield changes in such areas. Then we've also talked about water scarcity because of the melting. But to be specific, for Mount Elgon, there is a research that has been done in Uganda that due to the disease outbreak, because or when we have floods, then we have more mosquitoes because of at the cooler mountain region, we'll have more mosquitoes. And when we have more mosquitoes, it means that most people are affected by malaria. So when we are looking at the adaptation strategies for especially communities staying at the mountainous areas, it's important to a large extent consider these communities as an affirmative action community. Because if we're talking about climate change in generality, the people within the mountainous areas even face higher challenges compared to those in other areas. And then there is also a need to look at when we are doing resource allocations, because most of the countries now, for example, today we are reviewing the NDCs. Every country is looking at submitting its NDC by deadline, of course, was most people have not worked towards the deadline, but most countries are looking at handling these deadlines by this year. It's very important that the NDC, despite the fact that it is capturing different sectors, agriculture, we need to relate this to the all other communities, but not singling out the mountain communities should be strategic. When we are talking about education, it also affects the education communities, the mountain communities in terms of education. For example, in Uganda, the recent flooding and the landslide in Bududa displaced so many students. They could not go to school. Different infrastructure was destroyed. So we need to look at the NDC in a holistic approach whereby no one is not left behind. And lastly, I would like to say that as we even come up with legislations, especially in the different sectors, but for example, in Uganda, we are trying to mainstream climate change in all the sectors of government. So when the different legislations are being passed, it's important that priority must also be, there must be consideration for the mountain communities, because I think for the first time, I wouldn't say that I've heard a lot of talk about the mountain communities that much in regards to climate change. But today I have realized, after getting to know that IP was organizing this this webinar, that actually the impacts on the mountainous communities are huge and enormous than even the other communities. So when we are doing legislations and revamping some of the different frameworks in the member states, it's important that the communities, especially those staying within the mountainous areas, are brought on board and are considered in terms of reintegration, adaptation for these communities to adapt to the various shocks, including the early warning, because sometimes countries do not even have the capacity to give early warning, so that maybe people can be resettled somewhere before the actual disaster happens. So I would say, to me, that's what basically I could talk about in regards to the communities that are faced with challenges of climate change. And it's actually a double tragedy for these communities, because whereas they face climate change, they are also faced by other factors, including going landless because of displacement. So basically, that's what I could say. Thank you so much for your kind listening.
Yes, thank you so much. No, that was very interesting. And I think that what you pointed out was really a lot of the interconnectedness between a lot of the issues related to climate adaptation, and how one thing can lead to another. So that was very interesting insight. Now we're going to turn to Ms. Marie-Noëlle Battistel, who is a member of parliament from France. She'll give a perspective from another part of the world. She will be speaking in French, so I invite anyone who is not a French speaker to please turn over to the English channel, just so you can make sure that you hear the interpretation. So, Madame Battistel, bienvenue.
please just turn on your
Vous
microphone?
pouvez, sélectionner unmute.
Perfect. My apologies. Good afternoon, good evening to all of you. First of all, thank you very much for this initiative, encouraging exchange around the initiatives across different countries. I think that it is incredibly interesting. For France, the issue of mountains was considered quite early on in the parliaments. We had our first law on mountains in 1975, and this was revised 40 years later in 2015 with Act 2 of the Mountain Law. The purpose of these legislative texts were to understand the need to take into account the specifics of mountains and the general standards that we want across all different topics in our parliament. And of course, climate change adaptation in the mountain. This is the first area affected by climate change. My previous colleague also mentioned this, giving some country specifics. In France, in the parliament, there is a need to repeat and insist on the specifics of mountains. In France, there are two mountain ranges, the mid-level and the high-altitude mountains, and the issues are obviously different. Each territory needs to be considered in a different way, and it needs to be adapted to the specific features. This is not always true in laws where there is just one major rule and we have to try to align all of territories in these frameworks. Whereas transitionary areas are not going to be able to operate in the same way. We're going to need to have supple rules in order to adapt to each territory. Let me give you some examples now for transition in the middle altitude mountains. This is true for ski stations as well that we've not talked about yet. We need to work on preparing the future for economic and tourist models. Mountains in France, close to large towns and cities, such as Grenoble or other cities, have rising temperatures in summer. The mountains are a source of cooler air. There is a need to prepare for having summer tourism, which will not necessarily be for skiing, but to be in cooler areas. This is an opportunity for downstream cities as well. My colleague mentioned the question of downstream cities. Ski resorts are a big issue for us at the moment. What model could help these villages and stations to continue so that residents can have as many services as possible whilst abandoning skiing due to a lack of snow? So how can they diversify their income streams? The French government has launched a number of initiatives. The Mountain Future Plan, with engineering funding available for ski stations and tourist areas in mountains. Earlier, I mentioned a difficulty as Parliament has to have a role of controlling and checking the distribution of this funding. Earlier, I mentioned the specific cases. In any case, I was discussing the transition for ski stations, which is an important concern in France. And beyond that, many populations
mais seulement vivent
not
en
impacted
montagne
by
ou
ski
en
stations,
moyenne
but
montagne. Et là
simply
se
live
posent
in the middle
d'autres
altitude
questions qui sont
mountainous
par exemple la
area.
question
Other
du
issues
transport et de la
affecting them
mobilité douce.
are
Quand on est
associated
très
with
éloigné des
transport
centres urbains,
and
il est
low
souvent très
carbon
difficile
transport
de pouvoir
solutions. It's
avoir
often very difficult
des
at
déplacements
higher
verts
altitudes to have green
pour se
mobility
rendre au travail.
solutions
Souvent, les
in order
personnes
to
ont
get to
50
work.
km à faire aller, plus
Most
50 retours,
people
et n'ont
have
pas la
around 50
possibilité forcément
kilometers to
de rouler
drive
en
to
voiture
work and get
électrique et
back, and
de
they're not
prendre du
able to
transport
use
collectif qui
electric
n'existe
cars
pas. Donc, il y a
or
aussi ce
public
maillage de
transport as this does
transport
not
doux
exist. There's also an
à
issue
installer dans les
associated
territoires de montagne.
with
Et puis, la collègue l'évoquait tout à
mountain
l'heure, il y a les
areas and the
naturels,
transport
entre guillemets,
networks. The
et
colleague
les événements
mentioned
climatiques qui
earlier
sont de plus en plus nombreux dans
natural
nos
hazards
territoires de
and
montagne, notamment
climate
les
events
glissements de
that are
terrain ou les crues
incredibly
qui ont
common now, such as
des effets
flooding
assez dévastateurs.
and
Et dans ma
landslides.
circonscription, j'ai
There
vu
can be
beaucoup d'exemples,
real
notamment la Bérarde, qui est un
devastating
site
effects in Berard, which is
d'alpinisme
a
reconnu à travers le
site
monde, qui a été
that's world
dévasté ce
renowned. It has
printemps.
been
Et on est de plus en plus
destroyed in spring,
finalement soumis à ce type
and
d'événements qui
we're
sont assez
increasingly suffering from
imprévisibles.
these kinds of
Vous évoquiez aussi
unpredictable
tout à l'heure
events.
l'hydroélectricité. C'est effectivement une
We also
production
heard about
qui est
hydropower
extrêmement
earlier,
précieuse dans les
which
territoires de
is
montagne,
a very
qui
precious
fournit
resource
aussi,
in
qui permet
mountains.
aussi l'équilibre du système électrique, et qui
And this
est produite dans les montagnes, mais qui joue aussi, les barrages jouent
allows
aussi un
for
rôle décréteur de
electricity
pluie, ce qui a
to be produced in
un
mountain
effet
areas,
évidemment
and
extrêmement
it
intéressant
also
pour
is very
gérer les
interesting
risques et
for
les événements
managing the
climatiques
risk of
à venir.
flooding as well.
Voilà un petit peu en
So
résumé
this
comment on
is
procède
a
aujourd'hui en France, quelles
summary
sont nos
of how we
préoccupations
are working in
et
France,
nos législations
the
que
concerns
nous
we
avons
have,
adaptées
and
aux
legislation
particularités de la
that
montagne.
we
Mais
have
je vais vous le
adapted
dire, on n'est
to
pas
mountain
majoritaire dans
specifics.
l'hémicycle en élus de montagne, et il faut
We are
s'unir
not in the
pour pouvoir
majority
faire prendre
MPs
conscience à tout le
living in
monde
the
de
mountains and
l'importance
working in the mountains. It's our
de
role
la vie en
to
montagne. Donc il faut
promote
anticiper, se préparer,
the
essayer d'inverser un
work
peu la
in
tendance
mountains, and we want to
en matière de
overturn the
réchauffement
trend
climatique, avec
for
beaucoup de
global
glaciers
warming
qui
as well,
fondent
with
malheureusement et qui
glaciers
peuvent
that are
à
melting,
terme poser aussi
unfortunately.
des
And in
problèmes
the long term,
d'alimentation
this
en eau
could
sur un
lead
certain
to
nombre
water
de
supply
villes en amont.
problems
Voilà
in
un
some
assez rapidement ce
downstream
que je
cities.
souhaitais
So
vous faire
that's
partager,
what I
mais à
wanted
votre
to share with
disposition
you,
pour aller
and
plus loin si
I'm
vous le souhaitez.
here to
Merci beaucoup.
talk about it more with you later on if you wish. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. For all these words, apologies. So it seems like we've had some hacking taking place, but thank you very much for giving your perspective, and I hope that we can continue to have a good conversation about it. Next up, I'd like to welcome Mr. Ignacio Yaque from the Fundación Glaciares Chilenos, who can provide us some perspective from civil society and how organizations are engaging with communities in a way that can also support the goals of parliamentarians. So, Ignacio, please feel free to go ahead. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Well, I want to begin by thanking you for the invitation to participate in this meeting. For us, as Fundación Glaciares Chilenos, it is fundamental to disseminate our work, connect with more people, and generate alliances that promote concrete actions to protect glaciers and mountain ecosystems. For those who don't know me, let me introduce myself. I am Ignacio Yaque, director of the foundation. I joined the team a few months ago, but I have been following its works closely long before that. And today, I want to share more details about what we do and why it is so important. Slide 2, please. What is Fundación Glaciares Chilenos? Fundación Glaciares Chilenos is a non-profit organization that focuses on education, dissemination, and protection of more than 26,000 glaciers in our territory. Through social media content, articles, scientific reports, and educational projects, we seek to bring glaciological knowledge to the public, highlighting its ecosystemic and social relevance. Our work is based on 3 solid pillars: education, dissemination, and action for the glaciers' protection. Slide 3, please. How many glaciers are there in Chile? Chile is a land of glaciers. Our geography shaped by the presence of the Andes Mountains allowed us to have glaciers throughout the country. There are approximately 215,000 glaciers globally, and Chile is home to 12% of them, representing 80.5% of the South American total. This reality position us as a key country in the conservation of this fundamental ecosystem for the climatic balance of the planet. Slide 4, please. Glaciers in Chile, according to the latest National Inventory of Glaciers of the General Water Directorate, update in 2023, Chile has more than 26 glaciers, covering a total area of more than 21,000 kilometers. Glaciers are present in all regions of the country, from the Altiplano in the north to Patagonia in the extreme south, guaranteeing the water supply of communities and ecosystems. For example, only in the metropolitan region, where Santiago is located, there are more than one sec, please. Oops. There are more than 1,200 glaciers that contribute directly to the water supply for the country's capital and most populated region. At the national level, 70% of the population is supplied with water of mountain range origin. Slide 5, please. Well, what have been our main actions? In more than 6 years of work, we have developed multiple initiatives aimed at education, dissemination, and protection of glaciers. More than 2,400 educational publications on social networks reach more than 4.5 million people interested in glaciological content. Talks and workshops to more than 400 students in different regions of the country. Presentation of the bill for the creation of the National Glaciers Day in collaboration with Fundación Plantae and parliamentarians committed to the cause. Slide 6. Six, please. One less? Yeah. Next. Well,
Sorry.
this summary, don't worry. This summary reflects 6 years of collaborative work with local communities, students, research centers, academics, scientists, parliamentarians, and civil society, all with common goals: to bring knowledge about glaciers to more people, inspire them to learn, and above all, act in their protection. Slide 7, please. Next, please. Thank you. And how to support us? 2025 has been declared by the UN as the International Year of Glaciers Preservation. We invite you to join our glacier community, follow our work, participate in our activities, and become ambassadors for the protection of these ice giants, which are fundamental to our present and future. Thank you very much for your attention. Sorry for my English, but we are very glad to be here today.
Yes, thank you so much. No, it was a wonderful presentation. Really appreciate to hear all of these different perspectives and to see a good example of how you can also get engaged on a more community level issue, especially as it is the year of glaciers preservation. So thank you very much, Ignacio. And if you have any questions, please, yes, feel free to put them in the chat. So now we've heard some very interesting examples from different parts of the world also, and I hope that these can be sources of some inspiration for others who have joined our roundtable discussion here today. I'd like to change gears a bit and turn over to those who are in the audience. I do believe that we have several members of parliament who are present, and I would like to give the opportunity to MPs who wish to share perspectives or experiences from their countries as well. As a first question, maybe to kick us off, is, are there any additional good practice examples in your countries that you think are interesting or that you would like to share? And as a secondary question, also we can discuss maybe what are some of the barriers or the difficulties for implementing legislation on climate change adaptation in mountains? This is also, something that we'd be interested in hearing about too. So I'd like to ask if you could please keep the remarks short so we can allow as many people as possible to speak. If you do have something to share, please feel free to raise your hand, or you can also ask the question in the chat. We've also prepared a Mentimeter, which is available to collect some additional insights. So if you prefer to share your thoughts via Mentimeter, please go ahead and click on the link that will be shared in the chat. And if not, if anyone wants to share some of a good example from your country, or even just some of the challenges or barriers that you face, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'd love to hear your perspective. And yes, the Mentimeter link has also been placed into the chat as well for now. Okay. Maybe while we're waiting for people to think of some answers or some questions that they might have, I may have another one as well, perhaps for some of the parliamentarians. I'm not sure. I'm wondering, what we might be thinking about this issue of tourism as well. We did hear one aspect, which is talking about tourism in summer and winter months when we think about skiing and why that's important, but also in the summer times when mountains become a place of refuge from the high temperatures. Perhaps that's also an aspect to think about. I wonder. Perhaps we could also turn back to one of our members of parliament, maybe if Ms. Jacqueline Amongen is still here. I was wondering, you did share some really interesting examples about how mountain areas have been facing, this triad of flooding and droughts and landslides and all of these things that are happening one after the other. But maybe you could share a bit, how has it worked in Uganda to respond to this through a legislative mechanism? I'm not sure if Miss Jacqueline is still here.
Okay, so thank you so much, Alex. I wanted to say that of recent, it's been like years whereby Uganda has not been, had never had the issue of like landslides. But due to the emerging climate changes, the landslides have become common now. So it has been more into emergency response. And of course, that would be like addressing disasters. But in our legislation, which we passed, the climate change law, which was adopted by Uganda, there has been a co-option of all those aspects, including the mountainous communities, and including the adaptation measures have been put in place so that some of the communities are given ample time, early warning systems, including giving these particular communities within the mountainous areas incentives in agriculture, because they are not able to cultivate where they used to traditionally do cultivation. So government has even had to even give them extra land so that they can be resettled there, and those who are willing to relocate can for sure relocate. But traditionally, people who are already used to a particular environment had to relocate. So government tries to give them as much information as possible so that they are able to take a decision. So also, because water becomes scarce for these communities, their government has put down strategies like irrigation systems so that these people can be helped in terms of accessibility to water resources. But most important is awareness raising and ensuring that these mountainous communities that were not earlier being looked at as one of the communities under threat by climate change is one of the top priorities now for the government of Uganda. Besides that, as at the continental level, we are coming up with a model framework law on climate change. And this is an area we will be reviewing this model framework before it is finally adopted by the different parliaments next week. I think I will have to keenly engage other parliamentarians from the different parts of the continent so that in this model law, there is need to look at those communities that are very vulnerable, including the mountainous communities. So I'm talking about Uganda, but I think this is an issue that can also be looked upon in other countries as they come up with their relevant frameworks on climate change. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. That was also a very interesting commentary. I'd like to give the opportunity for others to share thoughts or ask questions if they have them. But another question did occur to me for Ms. Battistel also, which is maybe if she could elaborate a bit on if there are some concrete actions that parliamentarians can take to help to promote some income diversification for mountain communities that rely on tourism. Obviously, mountain tourism is very important for France, but maybe there are some tactics that can be put into place, or what are some of these other plans that could be useful in these circumstances where ski tourism might be in the decline, or other things like that. So maybe Ms. Battistel has something to say on this topic.
Yes, thank you very much. I did mention this topic because in France it is an important concern, particularly in the mountains, because we do have a multitude of small and mid-sized ski stations facing a reduction in snowfall. Some of these ski stations have a low altitude and a high altitude component within their station. in order
en fait,
to
il ne faut pas tomber dans
diversify.
l'acharnement et la
I
course,
think there is a real
évidemment,
race
derrière le
now
ski, mais en même
to
temps,
protect
on ne peut
ski
pas
tourism.
tourner la page du ski de
We
manière
can't turn the
brutale.
page
Et justement, il faut
in a
anticiper pour
sudden
pouvoir
way.
préparer
We
l'ensemble
need
des
to
acteurs et des
prepare all
socio-professionnels de la montagne
socio-professional
à
segments in the
une
mountain
transition et une
for
mutation de leur
transition and
métier qui
changes
va
to
devenir
their
pour un
careers.
certain nombre
For some of them,
obligatoire.
this
Donc,
transition will be
nous avons
mandatory.
engagé des dispositifs
We have
d'accompagnement parce que
support
je pense que
systems
les
in
collectivités qui
place.
sont porteuses de
The
stations, souvent
municipalities
ce sont de
that
petites
have
communes et
stations
qui
are
n'ont pas de
often small
capacité
communities
financière
without
extrêmement
large
importante.
financial
C'est pas forcément
resources.
des domaines de
These
ski
are
qui sont
not
gérés
always
par des
ski
privés
stations
et qui peuvent
managed
investir de
by
manière importante, mais
private
quelquefois par des
companies that have a lot of money.
collectivités.
Some of them
Donc,
are managed by
je
local
pense que
authorities.
l'accompagnement de l'État
So
par des
state
dispositifs
support
comme le plan Avenir
through
Montagne
the
qui avait été mis en place
Mountain
il y a
Future
3 ans en
scheme in
France,
place in France
doit
over the past
effectivement
3 years
trouver une deuxième vague
has
pour pouvoir accompagner ces
provided
territoires
support
et en
to
faire
these
des
territories
territoires
to
d'accueil
make
qui se
them
tournent de plus en plus. Alors on dit souvent
areas
le tourisme 4 saisons, ce qui n'est pas
that are able
véritablement
to have
vrai, mais en
tourists
tout
over
cas
all 4
une
seasons.
saison
Perhaps that's
d'hiver et une
not
grosse saison
always true,
d'été
but to
qui
have a
déborde sur
winter
l'automne
season and
et le
also a
printemps.
large
Parce que
summer
moi je pense que
season
de plus
from
en plus
autumn
la
through to
montagne
from spring
sera
through to autumn.
appréciée de beaucoup plus de monde et
There
on aura une
are a lot
fréquentation
more
qui va
people who
grandir
want
en
to
montagne
come
l'été. Et
to the
aujourd'hui, on n'est
mountains
pas
in the summer,
forcément
and we're
prêt
not
à
necessarily
l'accueil
ready
de ces
for that
nouveaux
yet.
de
We're
ces
not
nouveaux
ready to welcome
adeptes de la
these
montagne.
new
Il faut
mountain
aussi
lovers.
apprendre la
We
montagne
need
aux
to
gens
teach
parce que
people how
la connaître,
to
c'est la
work
respecter.
and live in the
Et donc en
mountain.
montagne, on a
People
aussi
visiting the
toute cette
mountains don't necessarily
initiation
know
à la
it, and
pratique
they need to respect
montagneuse.
it.
Et c'est pour ça que en
And
France,
that's
on avait
why
une
in
grosse
France there's a
culture
real culture
de tourisme
of
social et
social
notamment
tourism
d'accueil de classes en montagne, que
and
ce soit l'hiver ou
classes,
l'été.
school
Et
classes that go
malheureusement,
to the
souvent ces
mountains in the
centres de
summer.
vacances trouvent beaucoup de
But these
difficultés
holiday centres
à se mettre aux
are
normes et à continuer à
struggling to
accueillir. Et
continue
c'est
to
quand
welcome
même
these
fort dommage
groups
parce
because
que
of falling
c'est là qu'on
standards. And this is a
initie
real
nos jeunes
shame
enfants
because
à la
we're
pratique de la
training
montagne, au respect
children
de
in
la
how
montagne, au
to
respect
visit
de
the
la faune et de la
mountains, how
flore.
to
Et donc,
respect
il
the
faut aussi
flora and the
soutenir
fauna.
ce
We need to
tourisme
support
social
this
et
kind of
accompagner,
social
permettre l'accompagnement de
tourism
plus en plus
and
d'enfants
support
vers
children
des vacances à la neige quand il y a de la neige, mais
visiting the
à la
snow when
montagne
there is
tout
snow on
court
the mountains as well,
sur
but
les autres
also
saisons.
knowing how to
Donc,
exist in the mountains in
c'est
other
très important
seasons. It's very important
sur ces
in these
territoires
territories
d'anticiper,
to
pas de voir
anticipate.
brutalement,
We
parce
don't
qu'on a
want
quelques
a
exemples où le ski
brutal
s'est
or
arrêté d'un coup d'un
sudden
seul
change. We've
et
had a lot
personne n'y
of
était véritablement
examples
préparé. Et
where
là, on a tout
people
un
have not been
écosystème qui
prepared
tombe
and an entire
et
ecosystem
où on
can
a
fall
par
apart,
exemple
where we
l'agriculture
have
de
mountain
montagne est très
agriculture
liée
that's
à
very
l'activité
linked to
ski aujourd'hui
skiing
dans un
in
certain
some
nombre
places
de
at the
secteurs et
moment.
où les agriculteurs sont
And
moniteurs de ski
often
l'hiver
farmers can be ski
ou
teachers in the
perchman
winter
sur les remontées
or
mécaniques et ils nous
repairmen
disent que
for the
60% de leur
chairlifts,
revenu de
and
l'année est fait
60%
l'hiver.
of
Donc si
their
on leur enlève
income
ça,
is in
ils ne
winter.
peuvent plus
If we remove
véritablement
that from them, they're not
vivre
going to be able
correctement. Donc
to
il faut
maintain their
également
quality
prendre en
of
compte
life. So
cette
we need
nécessité
to take
d'adaptation
into
de l'agriculture de
account
montagne qui est précieuse
the
parce qu'elle
components of
façonne nos paysages. Je ne veux pas
agriculture
être plus longue parce qu'il
adaptation
y a
as well.
sûrement
I'm not
beaucoup
going to say
d'autres
much more. I'm
questions
sure there are plenty of
sur
other
les
questions
sujets
about
montagnards.
mountain issues, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Very much appreciate the comments on this as well. I did want to maybe take a moment to reflect on a further question too, which I could pose to the audience members, to the MPs who are here. But that's also so this year we know it's the update of the nationally determined contribution for each country, or NDC, which is the climate contribution given and submitted for under the Paris Agreement. So this is something that a country has submitted on behalf of itself. But one question that I would have is, what are some of the tangible efforts that parliamentarians should make in order to hold their governments accountable for climate action and their NDCs? And we already do have a few answers on this question in the Mentimeter. I'm just going to switch over and see that here. Let's see, are you able to see my screen? Yes. Okay. So first of all, we have what when we look at some of these tangible efforts, we have advocating for climate laws. I think that that's a really interesting example. Also, one that's popped up also in some of the comments is integrating disaster resilient infrastructure as part of the national adaptation strategies. This also there's a focus on ensuring critical infrastructure in mountains and social infrastructure. And this is a really key point. Mountain areas are often very separated from the main infrastructure systems maybe that a country has. So ensuring that these infrastructure systems are in place and that they are resilient to these natural hazards is also quite important. Also a good one, yes, is ensuring they're up to date on the country's relevant climate laws and checking on if they're being implemented. That's also an interesting one. And then there's also a question about specific NDCs for mountain protection from climate change. I believe as of now, there are several countries that do reference mountains in their nationally determined contributions, especially mountain areas that are key for renewable resources and developing hydropower. There's been some analysis on this in the past. But usually mountain protection should be integrated in the adaptation section of the NDC. So if countries are making plans for adaptation, it is something that's important to think about how mountain areas can be taken into account there. I wanted to see if there were some other questions in the chat. We have shared some resources as well. We did have some discussion about how best to educate different stakeholders. That was a good question as well. Does anyone else have any questions or comments at this time or something that they wish to share? Okay, if not, I would say that at this point, we do have also some further resources, which I wanted to just make sure get shared in the chat. We've developed with the Inter-Parliamentary Union an issues brief, which is on responding to climate change in the mountains, opportunities for parliamentarians to act. For this, we walk through several different key areas that I've mentioned earlier, and what are some really interesting examples of parliamentary actions that can be taken regarding the different areas such as water management, food security, biodiversity conservation, and several others. So this has some guidance there and also some good case studies as well. We have the Adaptation at Altitude Solutions portal, which is a portal filled with different tested climate adaptation options for mountain areas. It could be an interesting start to see what is being done in other countries and by different practitioners and groups and how they're responding to the different challenges. So that's also something that you can have a look at. And of course, as Carly pointed out to us before, the SDG-informed legislative scrutiny toolkit. This is also the toolkit, which does have a section on climate change. So these are some resources. And then finally, just for all of you who are still here with us, we do have another Mentimeter link, which is different from the first one that has been shared, which can be used to help us to collect some of the feedback on the event. This will be shared in the chat momentarily. So as we're trying as the Adaptation at Altitude program to continue our work on climate adaptation in mountain areas, your inputs are all really extremely valuable for us and help us to develop resources that serve you, both as a program and along with the IPU as well. So if you'd be willing to fill out this Mentimeter survey, I think it'll be shared in just a moment in the chat. Yes, there it is. You can go ahead and there are only a few questions, but it would be a really great help for us to get some ideas from you. So with that, I'd like to give you all some time now at the end of the event to fill out the Mentimeter. And thank you all for joining our roundtable today. And a big thank you, of course, to the IPU who has helped to convene the event, and wishing everybody a good rest of your day. Thank you all very much. And feel free to send questions in the chat as well. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Many
Thank you
thanks.
very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.